May 2019. Downtown Atlanta, Georgia. The revolving glass doors of the hotel spun once, then stopped. A little boy clutched a worn blue backpack with both hands as two uniformed security officers stepped into his path. Behind him stood his father, shoulders straight, one hand resting on the handle of a weathered suitcase. His boots still carried the pale dust of hundreds of construction sites. His shirt was neatly pressed despite the long drive. His eyes never left his son. The lobby fell strangely quiet. Business travelers slowed their steps. A bellman stopped polishing a brass luggage cart. Someone lowered a newspaper. The younger security officer glanced at a printed report before speaking. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." The father blinked once. "There must be a mistake." His voice stayed calm, measured, the kind of voice that came from years of solving problems instead of creating them. The little boy looked up. "Dad." The father gave him the smallest reassuring smile. "It's all right." It wasn't. No one in the lobby understood why the room had suddenly changed. Not yet. And almost nobody noticed the single detail resting inside the man's jacket pocket. That detail would change everything before the day was over. The man was Marcus Ellison, a fictional character inspired by the experiences many black travelers and professionals have described over the years. He was 38 years old, a widowed father raising his 8-year-old son, Isaiah, alone. Marcus wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't looking for attention. He simply believed that if he worked hard, kept his promises, and treated people with respect, life usually met him halfway. Most days it did. This day would test every one of those beliefs. Outside, a spring rain tapped softly against the hotel windows. The streets glistened beneath gray skies while buses hissed to a stop along Peachtree Street. Office workers hurried beneath umbrellas. Delivery trucks backed into loading docks with a steady beeping that echoed through downtown. Inside the lobby, polished marble reflected warm chandelier light. Fresh coffee drifted from the cafe. Suitcases rolled across stone floors. Every ordinary sound suddenly seemed louder because nobody wanted to be the first person to speak. The senior security officer cleared his throat. "Sir, management has requested that you leave the property." Marcus didn't argue. He had learned long ago that raising his voice rarely improved difficult moments. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket. Not for anger. Not for confrontation. For paperwork. His reservation confirmation. A government-issued identification card. A company travel authorization. Everything organized inside a simple leather folder worn smooth at the corners. He handed them over with steady hands. His hands told their own story. Small scars crossed his knuckles. Calluses lined his palms. The hands of someone who built things instead of breaking them. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so more overlooked moments, whether historical or inspired by real experiences, can reach people who might otherwise never hear them. The security officer barely glanced at the documents. "I'm sorry." The words sounded sincere. "But we've been instructed not to allow you to remain." Not allow. Marcus quietly repeated those words inside his mind. Not because they hurt. Because they didn't explain anything. Isaiah tugged gently on his father's sleeve. "Did we do something wrong?" Marcus knelt until they were eye level. "No." One word. Soft. Certain. "No." Let me tell you about Marcus before anyone in that lobby decided they already knew him. He grew up on the south side of Atlanta watching his grandfather repair broken furniture in a cramped workshop behind a modest brick house. Every Saturday began the same way. Sweep the floor. Sharpen the tools. Finish yesterday's work before starting today's. His grandfather often said that character revealed itself most clearly when nobody was watching. Marcus remembered those lessons every morning. He polished his boots, pressed his shirts, packed his son's lunch, checked homework, arrived early, stayed late. He believed discipline could become a kind of quiet language. After serving several years in the Army National Guard, he built a career managing commercial construction safety. His work required patience more than strength. He inspected scaffolding, electrical systems, heavy equipment, and emergency procedures. People rarely noticed a good safety manager. That usually meant the job had been done well. Coworkers described him the same way. Quiet, reliable, observant, never dramatic, never careless. Those habits followed him everywhere, including this hotel lobby where every detail now seemed strangely out of place. There was one receptionist who refused to look in his direction. One manager whispering into an earpiece. One guest recording with a phone from behind a decorative column. Nobody knew exactly what had been reported. Rumors spread faster than facts. Marcus noticed something else. The security officers weren't behaving like men confronting someone dangerous. They looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic, as though they had been handed instructions they didn't fully understand. That bothered him more than open hostility would have, because uncertainty often hid larger mistakes, or larger truths. Let me tell you about another detail that nearly everyone missed. Near the concierge desk stood an older woman folding a city map. She watched every exchange without interruption. She said nothing. She simply observed. Years later, she would remember one sentence with remarkable clarity. But that moment had not arrived yet. Rain intensified outside. Emergency lights from passing vehicles briefly reflected across the lobby ceiling before disappearing again into the afternoon traffic. Marcus slipped his reservation papers back into the leather folder. "If management would like to speak with me," he said evenly, "I'd appreciate the opportunity." The senior officer nodded. "I've already asked. And they're reviewing something." Reviewing. Another word without an answer. Isaiah shifted closer. His backpack zipper hung slightly open, revealing a folded science project he planned to show his classmates after the trip. Marcus quietly closed the zipper. Small routines. Small acts of care. The kind that fathers perform almost without thinking. Then the hotel's front doors opened again. A man in an expensive gray suit entered from the rain. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't angry. He walked directly toward the group with the confidence of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. Several employees straightened immediately. Someone whispered, "He's here." Marcus had never seen the man before. But the expression on the security officers' faces revealed something important. This wasn't the person who had started the situation. This was the person everyone had been waiting for. And the first words out of his mouth would change the course of the entire day. The man in the gray suit stopped a few feet from Marcus and Isaiah. Rainwater still clung to the shoulders of his tailored coat. He carried no umbrella, only a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. His polished shoes left faint, damp footprints across the marble floor before he came to a halt. He looked first at Marcus, then at the two security officers. Finally, at the manager standing several yards away. "What exactly is happening here?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched long enough for the question to become heavier than anyone expected. The hotel manager finally stepped forward. "Sir, we received a report from a guest who believed this individual was attempting to gain access to restricted guest areas without authorization." Marcus spoke calmly. "I checked in less than 10 minutes ago." "I understand. I showed my reservation. I know. I've asked several times what rule I've broken." Again, the manager hesitated. "We're still determining that." The words hung in the air like unfinished construction, supported by nothing solid. Isaiah reached for his father's hand. Marcus squeezed it gently. His heartbeat had quickened, but his face revealed almost none of it. Years of responsibility had taught him something few people ever mastered. Children borrow their courage from the adults beside them. If he panicked, Isaiah would remember panic. If he remained steady, perhaps his son would remember dignity instead. Across the lobby, conversations resumed in whispers. Some guests believed security must know something they did not. Others quietly questioned why no one seemed able to explain the accusation. One businessman folded his newspaper and watched with growing uncertainty. A woman returning from a conference shook her head almost imperceptibly. People often trusted first impressions. But they also recognized confusion when they saw it. The gray-suited man introduced himself simply as David Warren, the hotel's regional operations director. Like Marcus, he is a fictional character created for this dramatized story. David had spent decades managing difficult situations. He believed procedures existed for a reason. He also believed mistakes became larger whenever people stopped asking questions. He turned toward the security supervisor. Who made the original complaint? A guest on the 8th floor. What exactly did they report? They said they saw this gentleman wandering hallways. Marcus quietly raised one finger. I've never been upstairs. The supervisor glanced at his notes. No. I haven't even received my room key. The supervisor looked down again. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. There was one detail buried inside the incident report that nobody had discussed aloud. Not yet. David requested the printed report. He read slowly. Once. Then a second time. His expression changed almost invisibly. Not because he had found proof against Marcus. Because something didn't fit. The reported time of the alleged incident was nearly 15 minutes before Marcus's vehicle had entered the hotel's parking garage according to the security gate log. Nobody else in the lobby knew that. Let me tell you about how small administrative details can become the difference between justice and embarrassment. Modern hotels rely on overlapping systems. Parking records, electronic key cards, lobby surveillance, check-in software, time stamps. Each system tells only part of a story. Together, they reveal whether memory agrees with evidence. David quietly asked the front desk clerk to print the arrival records. The clerk hesitated before complying. Meanwhile, another complication arrived. A uniformed police officer entered through the revolving doors. Not with flashing lights. Not with urgency. Simply responding to what dispatch had received as a disturbance call. Officer Elena Brooks, another fictional character in this dramatized narrative, removed her rain cap and surveyed the room before approaching. Who's the reporting party? The manager stepped forward. Marcus remained where he was. Officer Brooks noticed that immediately. Most people expecting trouble either paced or protested. Marcus did neither. He stood beside his son with one suitcase, one backpack, and remarkable patience. She addressed him directly. Sir, are you willing to tell me what happened? I checked in. He paused. I was asked to leave. Why? I've been trying to find that out. Officer Brooks looked toward the manager. The answers differed less than she expected. That surprised her. Usually disagreements involved conflicting stories. Here, everyone agreed about what had happened. Only the reason remained strangely undefined. Isaiah quietly asked if he could sit down. Marcus nodded. The boy settled onto the suitcase, hugging his backpack against his chest. The science project inside remained untouched. Construction paper. Printed photographs. Carefully labeled diagrams. Marcus had promised they would visit the city's science museum after the business conference concluded. Promises mattered. Especially after Isaiah's mother had died 3 years earlier following a sudden illness. Grief had changed both of them. Marcus became quieter. Isaiah became more observant. Together they built routines that helped them move forward. Saturday pancakes. Homework before television. Bedtime reading. Sunday visits to Marcus's grandfather whenever possible. Those routines became anchors. Today, every one of them felt very far away. Near the concierge desk, the older woman still hadn't left. She finally approached Officer Brooks. I don't wish to interfere. The officer smiled politely. But I've been standing here since before that gentleman arrived. She pointed gently toward Marcus. He never went near the elevators. Several nearby guests looked up. The woman continued. I watched because I was waiting for directions. She folded the city map carefully. The report they're discussing couldn't have involved him. No dramatic speech. No raised voice. Just quiet observation. Sometimes history changes because someone refuses to ignore what they saw. Officer Brooks thanked her and wrote down her statement. David Warren compared the witness account against the printed report now handed to him by the front desk clerk. His eyes narrowed. The arrival timestamp confirmed Marcus had entered the building several minutes after the reported hallway incident. Someone had made a serious mistake. Or someone had accused the wrong man. Neither possibility reflected well on the hotel. The manager shifted uneasily. There may have been. He searched for the right words. A misunderstanding. Marcus answered without anger. I certainly hope so. That calm response affected the room more than outrage might have. Even the security officers seemed relieved he had not responded differently. Yet one question remained unanswered. If Marcus had never been upstairs, who had the guest actually seen? David turned another page inside the report. Attached to the complaint was a grainy still image captured from a distant hallway camera. The face was almost impossible to distinguish. But one thing was immediately clear. The man in the image was wearing a bright red jacket. Marcus had arrived wearing a navy blue button-down shirt beneath a charcoal work coat. The clothing didn't even remotely match. David looked slowly toward the manager. The manager stared back in disbelief. Before either could speak, the hotel's radio crackled loudly. The dispatcher on the other end sounded unusually urgent. Then every phone behind the front desk began ringing at once. Every ringing phone seemed to compete with the rain outside. The front desk staff exchanged uneasy glances before one clerk finally answered the nearest line. She listened for only a few seconds, then looked toward David Warren with an expression that drained the remaining color from her face. The guest who filed the complaint is downstairs, she said quietly. He wants to change his statement. The lobby grew still again. David closed the incident report without another word. Bring him here. Marcus remained beside Isaiah. He could have demanded an apology. He could have walked away. Instead, he rested one hand on his son's shoulder, keeping the same quiet posture that had carried him through every unanswered question since he entered the building. Officer Elena Brooks noticed it again. People under pressure often reveal who they truly are. Some become louder. Some become smaller. Marcus became steadier. A few moments later, a man in his late 50s stepped hesitantly from the elevator corridor. He wore a business suit that looked expensive but rumpled, as though he had been wearing it since dawn. His conference badge swung from a blue lanyard around his neck. His name was Richard Hale, another fictional character in this dramatized story. He stopped several yards away. His eyes moved from Marcus to the report in David's hands, then to the police officer. I think, he began. His voice faltered. I think I made a mistake. Nobody interrupted him. I saw someone trying door handles on the 8th floor. He swallowed hard. I called downstairs. David nodded once. And I later came through the lobby and saw. He looked toward Marcus before lowering his eyes. I assumed it was the same man. Officer Brooks asked gently, Did you actually recognize his face? Richard hesitated. No. You recognized his clothing? Another pause. No. What did you recognize? The answer took several seconds to arrive. I honestly don't know anymore. The admission settled over the room more heavily than any accusation had. Because mistakes were one thing. Assumptions were another. Marcus said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes carried more weight than argument. Yet the day still wasn't finished with him. A security dispatcher hurried across the lobby carrying a tablet. We found additional camera footage. David accepted it. The new recording came from a different hallway angle. The timestamp matched the original complaint. The image quality was clearer. A man in a bright red jacket appeared briefly, checking several room numbers before disappearing through a stairwell. He looked nothing like Marcus. Different height. Different build. Different clothing. Different everything. One question had finally been answered. Another immediately took its place. Where had the man gone? Let me tell you about why moments like these matter beyond a single misunderstanding. Technology can preserve evidence. But evidence alone cannot undo the experience of being judged before the facts are known. The cameras corrected the record. They could not erase what Isaiah had already seen. A child had watched adults question his father's right to stand in a hotel where he had done nothing wrong. Some lessons leave marks that never appear in photographs. Isaiah quietly tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Can we go to our room now?" Marcus looked down at him. "I hope so." Hope. Not certainty. David took a slow breath before addressing everyone gathered nearby. "It appears Mr. Ellison should never have been removed from the lobby." The manager closed his eyes briefly. The security officers exchanged defeated looks. Richard Hale stepped forward. "I'm sorry." Marcus studied him for a long moment. The apology sounded genuine. So did the regret. "I believe you are," Marcus replied. There was no triumph in his voice. Only exhaustion. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Thin afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement beyond the hotel's glass entrance. For the first time all day, it felt as though the tension might finally dissolve. Then another radio transmission shattered the calm. Multiple units responding. Suspect matching hallway footage spotted several blocks north. Officer Brooks turned sharply toward the dispatcher. "Confirmed. Confirmed." David looked back at the tablet. The suspect had been inside the building while Marcus was checking in. The realization struck everyone at once. Security had focused on the wrong person, while the actual suspect had walked away unnoticed. The lobby seemed smaller now. Every earlier decision carried new weight. The security supervisor removed his cap. "I should have checked the timestamps first." David answered quietly. "We all should have." Marcus didn't respond. He was watching Isaiah. The little boy had finally relaxed enough to unzip his backpack and look at the edges of his science project, making sure nothing inside had been damaged. It was such an ordinary act. It made the extraordinary morning feel even heavier. Let me tell you about another detail that often disappears after moments like these. People usually remember the headline. They rarely remember the witnesses. The bellman who never stopped believing something felt wrong. The receptionist who quietly preserved every timestamp instead of deleting records. The older woman with a folded city map who chose to speak when silence would have been easier. History is often held together by ordinary people willing to notice one small fact. Officer Brooks approached Marcus. "I'd like to document your statement, if you're willing." He nodded. "Of course." She opened her notebook. Before she could ask the first question, a black SUV pulled abruptly beneath the hotel's entrance canopy. Then another. And another. Not police vehicles. Corporate vehicles. Men and women in dark business attire stepped out with visible urgency. The hotel manager whispered under his breath. David didn't whisper. "They're from headquarters." No one had called them. At least, no one in the lobby admitted to doing so. The regional director frowned. "They shouldn't even know we're here yet." One executive walked directly toward David. Another toward the front desk. A third stopped near Marcus, introducing herself only as Angela Pierce, a fictional corporate compliance executive. She held a thin folder. "Mr. Ellison," she said carefully, "before anyone says another word, there's something you need to see." Marcus accepted the folder. Inside was a single printed page. His expression changed for the first time that day. Not anger. Not relief. Recognition. He looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" Angela's answer was barely above a whisper. "It was delivered anonymously to our headquarters this morning." Marcus stared at the document again. "It shouldn't even exist." Marcus looked at the page for several long seconds before carefully closing the folder. The document was not evidence of a crime. It was evidence of a process. Months earlier, Marcus's employer had been selected to conduct an independent safety assessment of several commercial properties owned by the same hotel company. His role had been straightforward: evaluate emergency procedures, identify vulnerabilities, and recommend improvements before they became tragedies. The report had never mentioned race. It had never mentioned individual employees. It simply documented where assumptions had replaced procedures. One recommendation appeared near the top of the page. Every security-related guest complaint should be verified through available evidence before removing or confronting a registered guest whenever immediate danger is not present. Marcus recognized his own words. He had written them. Angela Pierce spoke quietly. Our headquarters received an anonymous copy this morning, along with a note suggesting we compare today's incident against your recommendations. David Warren looked at the page. Then he looked at Marcus. His shoulders sank. We failed our own standard. No one argued, because no one could. The recommendation had existed before the incident. The tools to verify the complaint had existed before the confrontation. The parking records, the surveillance cameras, the electronic check-in logs. None of them had been consulted until after Marcus had already been publicly embarrassed. The failure was no longer difficult to identify. It had never been a lack of technology. It had been a failure to slow down. David turned toward Marcus. I owe you more than an apology. Marcus met his eyes. You owe the next guest something better. The words settled over the lobby with remarkable force. Not because they were loud. Because they shifted the conversation away from blame and toward responsibility. Even Richard Hale, whose mistaken assumption had begun the chain of events, stepped closer. I've replayed those few minutes in my head 100 times already, he admitted. I realized I filled in details that I never actually saw. Marcus nodded gently. We all do that sometimes. Richard shook his head. Not like this again. There was no dramatic redemption. No perfect speech. Only the quiet recognition that assumptions, once acted upon, can affect lives far beyond a single moment. Officer Brooks completed her report carefully. Her final notes reflected what the evidence now showed, not what anyone had first believed. Before leaving, she turned to Isaiah. I hope you still get to visit that science museum. The boy smiled for the first time all day. I think we will. Marcus smiled too. A small one, but real. The hotel offered another room. Marcus accepted, not because everything had been erased, but because refusing would not change what Isaiah had witnessed. Later that evening, father and son walked through the museum exactly as planned. Isaiah stopped longest in front of an exhibit about bridges. Steel beams. Load calculations. Invisible forces working together to support enormous weight. Marcus watched him read every word. You know, Isaiah said quietly, bridges stay up because people check everything twice. Marcus looked at him with a mixture of pride and sadness. That's exactly right. Let me tell you about what happened after that day. The fictional hotel company portrayed in this dramatized story commissioned an independent review of its guest interaction procedures. Training materials were rewritten to emphasize verification over assumption whenever circumstances allowed. Security officers practiced slowing situations down instead of accelerating them. Managers learned to consult available evidence before reaching conclusions. None of those changes guaranteed perfection, but they made similar mistakes less likely. David Warren remained with the company. He became one of the strongest advocates for those revised procedures. Whenever new managers asked why the policies mattered, he rarely mentioned legal risk. He talked instead about trust. It takes minutes to lose, he often said, and years to rebuild. Richard Hale carried his own lesson home. Months later, he volunteered with a community dialogue program where people from different backgrounds discussed perception, bias, and decision-making. He never presented himself as a villain. He presented himself as someone who had learned the cost of certainty without evidence. Sometimes that honesty reached people more effectively than perfection ever could. Officer Brooks continued her career believing something she had already suspected. Professionalism is measured not by how quickly authority is exercised, but by how carefully facts are gathered. She shared that lesson with younger officers whenever she trained them. The older woman with the folded city map eventually wrote a letter to the hotel. Not to criticize. To remind them that ordinary witnesses matter. Her letter ended with a simple sentence. The truth usually has more observers than we realize. Marcus returned to work the following Monday. He inspected construction sites with the same careful attention he had always given them. Steel connections. Emergency exits. Protective equipment. He understood something his grandfather had taught him years before. Character is not tested during easy days. It is revealed during difficult ones. His routines remained unchanged. Polish the boots. Pack Isaiah's lunch. Finish today's work well enough that tomorrow begins with confidence instead of regret. Those habits became their own quiet legacy. Isaiah never forgot the hotel lobby. Not because security stopped his father. Because of what happened afterward. He remembered watching adults admit mistakes. He remembered evidence replacing assumptions. Most of all, he remembered his father refusing to let humiliation become hatred. Years later, whenever classmates argued or rushed to conclusions, Isaiah often asked a simple question before taking sides. What do we actually know? It became a habit. One learned not from comfort, but from experience. Let me tell you about why stories like this continue to matter. This narrative is fictional, but it draws inspiration from real experiences many people have described. Moments when first impressions, assumptions, or incomplete information shaped how they were treated. History is filled with famous court cases, landmark legislation, and widely remembered speeches. Yet countless quieter moments never appear in textbooks. Moments inside hotel lobbies, airports, stores, schools, office buildings. Places where ordinary people are asked, sometimes unfairly, to prove they belong. Those moments rarely make headlines. But they shape families. They shape children. They shape the way communities learn to trust, or struggle to trust, one another. Real progress often begins with remarkably ordinary decisions. To ask one more question. To verify one more fact. To listen one moment longer. To notice the detail everyone else overlooked. The marble floor of that Atlanta hotel reflected the evening lights just as it had reflected the uncertainty that morning. Guests checked in. Suitcases rolled by. Conversations resumed. To almost everyone passing through those revolving doors, it became another ordinary day. For Marcus and Isaiah, it became something else entirely. Not a story about anger. Not a story about revenge. A story about dignity that refused to disappear under suspicion, about evidence that eventually spoke louder than assumption, and about the quiet courage of people who chose truth over convenience. Sometimes history remembers great victories won in crowded courtrooms or on famous streets. Sometimes it begins with a father holding his son's hand, standing calmly in a hotel lobby, believing that the truth is worth waiting for, and proving that dignity can be the strongest answer of all.